Whether you're new to mastering or you've been doing it for a while, these tips will improve your projects. I've consolidated my favorite and what I believe to be the most useful mastering concepts into one video, so let's discuss 7 actually useful mastering tips. Starting off, let's talk about picking a monitoring level. So this step gets skipped all the time. I'm guilty of skipping it myself sometimes, but if you pick a monitoring level before you begin a project, it's incredibly beneficial. What you do is either buy a SPL meter, which you can get for around $10 online, or download an SPL meter on your phone and hold it from your listening position. Aim for between 80 to 85 SPL. At this level, you can listen for up to 8 hours without damaging your hearing. Additionally, you'll perceive the frequency response as relatively flat compared to other loudness levels. Lastly, higher air pressures tend to distort the sound by pushing air molecules in ways that naturally sound distorted, or in ways that don't result in a sine wave. So, if you pick an SPL before you begin mastering, you can guarantee that your monitoring stays consistent and you won't damage your hearing. Once you start your project, I'd recommend starting with phase rotation. So once you have a monitoring level set, introduce phase rotation if you have the RX platform. It doesn't change the sound, it should even null if you compare it to the original signal. However, it ensures that the polarity is equally represented in both the positive and negative sides of the waveform. In other words, it keeps the track from causing a processor to misread the level. Similar to setting an SPL, this gives you consistency. You know your processors will behave the way that they're designed to when you're mastering, and like setting an SPL, it takes about 30 seconds to do. Next, let's cover being selective with a side image high-pass filter. Using a high-pass side image filter has become a pretty common practice. It's a quick and effective way to center low frequencies, in turn ensuring that the lows stay driving and are mono-compatible. However, where to set the high-pass filter is somewhat up for debate. I've heard up to 130 Hz, I've heard no higher than 80 Hz, and I've heard not to use one at all. But I suggest setting it somewhere between the fundamental and the second-order harmonic, usually as high as the fundamental goes, if that doesn't go too high. Granted, this moves around whenever a note changes, but you'll be able to find a general area. This accomplishes a couple of things. First, we can ensure that the fundamental stays mono. Second, we know that the low mids retain some width, which is needed to keep the master impressive and full. Don't add this type of filter for classical or jazz genres, but for everything else, start between the fundamental and second-order harmonic, and then use your ears to determine the best center frequency. Let's take a listen to a track without a side image high-pass filter, then one with a high-pass that's set too low, then one that's set too high, before listening to it centered in the range that I just recommended. Next up, let's cover the value of RMS compression. So compression is often avoided when mastering for the sake of retaining peaks. This makes sense. Too much compression and the impact of the track is going to be lost. But if you compress thoughtfully, you can drastically reduce the need for limiting later on, in turn, retaining the peaks in the long run. Now, the best way to accomplish this is with RMS or root mean square compression, which measures the loudness instead of the peak level. If a longer attack is used, and only 1 to 2 dB of compression at most is introduced, we could retain the peaks and reduce the dynamic range in an almost inaudible way. However, when it comes time to introduce limiting, we have a denser track that could be pushed higher in amplitude without as much peak attenuation as would have otherwise been needed. So let's take a listen to subtle RMS compression. Notice how difficult it is to hear, and yet the dynamic range is controlled. I'll use this U-He compressor, but Kotelnikov by Tokyo Dawn Labs is a great free compressor with RMS detection. Get professional analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head. Seriously though, when people work with us, they get results. That's why major industry professionals like Keith Urban's producer Aaron Schurz works with us, Grammy Award-winning AJ Castillo, Billboard #1 charted artist Megan Lindsay, Grammy Award-winning artist Tulis, The Voice singer Cody Ballou, Grammy-nominated producer Tyler Kane, Warner Music artist Ricky Young, and the list goes on. Watch the rest of this video, and at the end, use the link in the description to get direct access to us for personalized analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head. Next up, I'd recommend combining maximization and limiting. So limiting is useful, but once it's audible, it has an unpleasant sound. It uses look-ahead to turn down peaks, resulting in less distortion than a clipper or compressor, but it really deadens the transients once attenuation is greater than 3 dB, and of course it gets worse from there. It's usually the go-to for newer engineers, which means it's often overused. Fortunately, upward processing can and often is combined with limiting to create a much better final sound. Vintage Warmer 2 by PSP, Inflator by Sonix, Omnipressor by Eventide, and others are great options if you want to combine maximization with limiting to create a louder sound without the need for aggressive peak attenuation. You could also use parallel compression for a similar effect, which has been a popular mastering technique for a while. Combined with a linear phase EQ, you could amplify ranges that sound too empty or as if masking is taking a toll. It's simple, but sounds significantly better than aggressive limiting alone. Let's take a listen to two tracks. One is limited aggressively to reach -8 LUFS, and then the same track is maximized and then limited to reach that same LUFS. Let me know which one you think sounds better in the comments. Next up, I recommend you forget surgical EQ. If you're mastering and you're adding notch filters or narrow band filters, either you're overthinking it or the mix needs to be adjusted. Not only is this form of processing destructive due to the severity of the filters, but it also goes against a cardinal rule in mastering, that is to augment what's there. That doesn't mean that subtractive EQ doesn't have a place, but the filters should be gradual and subtle. Mastering isn't for fixing a mix, it's for augmenting it. And if you're adding narrow bell filters or plugins like Soothe 2 on your master, then I'd highly recommend reconsidering that decision. Alternatively, you could use tone shapers or simple EQs. There's a good reason why Pultecs are popular. They're so gradual that each filter spans multiple octaves, and yet they're used in mastering because that's what's most beneficial. Does the bass relate well to the mids to the highs to the air frequencies, and so on? These are better questions to consider when mastering than is this exact frequency too harsh or too aggressive. So let's listen to a track tone-shaped and then compare it to one in which I've used multiple narrow filters in a way that I've observed happening during mastering sessions. Last up, let's talk about balancing loudness across vocals. So I won't tell you how loud to make your masters, that's of course your decision and it depends heavily on the genre. However, there is one consistent loudness that I'd recommend adhering to when you're mastering a larger project. If you're working on an EP or an album and you want it to have a consistent sound across the tracks, focus on the perceived loudness of the vocal. The overall LUFS of the track matters less than the vocal's perceived level. When people listen to it track to track, or maybe they skip around to their favorites, they'll focus on the vocal. If two tracks are the same LUFS, but one has a quieter sounding vocal than the other, that track will be perceived as quieter. With that in mind, before you start mastering a larger project, adjust the tracks with clip gain to create a consistent level for the vocals from track to track. Get professional analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head. Seriously though, when people work with us, they get results. That's why major industry professionals like Keith Urban's producer Aaron Schurz works with us, Grammy award-winning AJ Castillo, Billboard #1 charted artist Megan Lindsay, Grammy award-winning artist Tulis, The Voice singer Cody Ballou, Grammy-nominated producer Tyler Kane, Warner Music artist Ricky Young, and the list goes on. Why waste your time creating masters that don't accurately translate what you hear in your head when you could instantly fix a problem by clicking the link in the description and working directly with professionals who have already done what you're trying to do? We've mastered thousands of songs that accurately translate what each client hears in their head, and it'll work for you too. Click the link in the description now and get direct access to us for personalized analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head.